So greetings. Now you've got your assessments kind of in your brain and you're starting to work on developing your assessments for your unit. And we want to talk about for a few minutes instruction and assessment for ELs, working with ELLs. Many of you will have English as a second language students in your classrooms, students that are maybe multilingual but don't speak English. So what kinds of things can you do to help them be successful and provide them opportunities to show you they have successfully learned and met just standards. So you've seen this in cultural relevant instruction, and we're talking about it again here. You need to get to know your students. You want to spend time finding out who they are. You want to learn what their cultural capital is, and we spend a little bit of time talking about cultural capital on the last slide in Module 5. What do students bring to the instructional setting that can help you help them? And we're talking about match, no match, degree of congruency. So this is something I did not talk about in the last module. What we're doing is we have a situation where the closer the culture is like that in the United States or in most places in the United States, the more likely and easier it will be for students to pick up on new learning. The farther away that match is, for example, between rural Alaska and urban Alaska, will create a situation where it's more difficult for students coming in from rural Alaska to urban Alaska to access new learning. So this is trying to balance it out, create a degree of congruency that will help students, give students access to academics and social cultural capital. So what does that look like in terms of language? You have students that come in that don't speak English, and you'll notice that we all have different ways of speaking depending on who we're with, family, friends, community, school, when we're out hunting and fishing, or in the workplace. And we do all these things: speaking, listening, auditory, kinesthetic, reading, writing, speaking, visual. All that language is specific to our culture. When a child comes to our classrooms from another world culture or even another local culture, they are learning a new domain of language. And school has its own domain of language. Where's my little cursor here? School has its own domain of language. And so you're taking a child from a community who has a certain way of doing things, way of using language, and you're teaching them a new way with language. You're teaching them how to access the language in school and the culture in school. So to challenge a child not to speak a certain way is probably not productive. What might be productive is to say, you come to school and you speak like you're with your family and your friends. And I'm suggesting to you that this is a different way of speaking, that we speak schoolese, we speak academic language. And I'm here to help you learn it. I want you to learn to practice using it while you're here in school. And then when you go home, you've got your language with your family and your friends and your community, and no different. Because they have their other language already in place. We're not going to replace that. We're just adding to the pot, so to speak. And it's a big pot because they come to school for a long time. So this is a whole new way of being in many ways. One of the things that we notice with students that come in not speaking English or speaking limited English is that they learn how to speak conversational language more quickly than they do academic language. Conversational language can be learned comfortably with an average learner and an average speaker about, between 1 and 3 years, depending on their educational background. It does make a difference. I had a little boy whose mother and father didn't speak a lick of English, and his mother was a teacher, and his father was a restaurateur. And this kid was teaching the other kids in the class English by his first year in school, and he was a first grader. He learned very, very fast. So it just depends on their background. But generally speaking, that's the exception, not the rule. Academic language comes 3 to 7 years in. And the minute they come in later than kindergarten or first grade, they will always be playing catch up unless they are really immersed in a second language acquisition place in school for a period of time. So what does BICS look like? Basic interpersonal communicative skills. It's language proficiency in context of social communication. It's less cognitively demanding. It's not hard to think about Where's the bathroom? Where's the library? I'm hungry. I don't feel well. Face-to-face interaction, extensive gestures, and context. There's just a lot of surrounding information when they're at this level of language use. Language is expressed through listening and speaking and is rarely seen in print form. So there's these kids having a picnic, don't have to say write and say I want to, or they're actually doing crafts. I write down I want some beads. No, just here. I need the beads. Here you are. First and second languages are in constant interaction, and notice that everything you do with ELLs and second language learners needs to include interaction because that's how they learn. It's a coaching thing. It's a zone of proximal development. The cognitive academic language proficiency, the CALP, is what we have in school. I was talking about school language. Language proficiency related to academic setting. It's more intellectually demanding, it's harder, it's more because it's more abstract, and because there's a time limit for clarification. And those of you that know have had to work through curriculum and move through pages without being provided the opportunity to stop, pause, and reteach, understand exactly what's happening with these kids. It's like if any of you have learned a second language and somebody was going too fast for you and never went back, that's how it feels. And just so that you just want to keep that in your imagination when you're working with ELLs. In school, we identify between BICS and CALPS this way. The state has the WIDA performance definitions, and these are the language performance definitions they give for entering through reaching. And entering is really where a student is at BICS level. They use pictographic representations of language in content areas, words, phrases, oral language, and that's pretty much it. And then each level, you're adding more and more language skill, more and more language, more and more language, more and more language until it's reaching, they're almost speaking like a native speaker of English. Or it would be another language in another country, but here we're talking about learning English, and this is it. I have here see-can-do descriptors. Those of you that are in classrooms, this will be very useful to you, especially when you're reading the access test scores. And here's a link for you. This is a way you can access the information about what you can do related to the level that each student is at based on the WIDA performance definitions. So this is basically, they could function reasonably well in a CALP situation, and this is where students are basically functioning in a BICS situation. So how are we going to address this in the classroom? Representation is very important. How are you going to present information so that students can access it, and how are you going to ask them to show you what they've learned? And basically, this is a simplified version of an always complex situation. Visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. Can you see it? Can you hear it? Can you do it? See it, hear it, do it. If you provide every lesson with a VAK at the beginning and in the middle and at the end, you'll be able to provide access to just about everybody in the class. How many of you, and this is, obviously you're not going to raise your hands because I can't see you, but how many of you really like to have pictures in addition to text? There's nothing wrong with that, not even for older students. And it really helps people access the context of it. The other piece is model, model, model. Model everything. Model everything. And it's, if you go to Teach Like a Champion, model everything. I do, we do coached, guided practice, and then independently. And some places you have to do a lot of we do's before you send them off to the you do. Vocabulary development also, I'm going to talk a little bit about vocabulary development here. Vocabulary development is the single strongest predictor of academic success for ELLs. So there are things that support incidental vocabulary learning and intentional vocabulary learning. Incidental is what you get from just listening and interacting with people. I'll keep using that interaction. Interacting with their peers, with the target language, rich oral language experiences, those of you that know how to do of course, it just goes right out of my brain. When you have the language experience approach, you go somewhere, you have them dictate what they write it down, and they read it back to you. So you've got reading, writing, listening, speaking all involved in that, but they've experienced what they're reading and what they're writing about. Wide reading, teacher read alouds, and independent reading, all these things help incidental vocabulary learning when you talk about the book you're reading. Intentional vocabulary learning is when you're teaching vocabulary. You're teaching specific word instructions in texts, using student-friendly explanations, pictures, it's not there, right? Active engagement with words. Those of you that know Anita Archer, she's fabulous. There's a program, WordGen, grade 6-8, that has vocabulary instruction sequences, so does Marzano, so does Kinsella. You can find all sorts of vocabulary, really great vocabulary teaching material. Word learning strategies, dictionary use. Now I'm going to say something about dictionary use. I know I put it here, but do not give a student a dictionary when they're functioning at Bix and Calp level. They should probably not even have it until they're at level 6. Because if they don't know what a word means, a dictionary isn't going to help them. If they don't know how to spell the word, a dictionary isn't going to help them. So a dictionary is used to confirm and deep knowledge after they've got it, after you've front-loaded the vocabulary. Morphemic analysis, that's the fancy way of saying teaching them how to look at word parts. Contextual analysis, same thing, teaching them how to infer meanings of the words in text. And cognates, always fun, are words that are similar in the first language to the second. For example, computadora and computer. Salsa and salsa. Salsa is salsa in all languages, right? So, but words that are the same in English as they are in their native languages. And so a lot of the technical words are that way. So a way to teach intentionally would be to use, this is one example of many types of vocabulary organizers, the Frayer Model, where you have the definition of the word, the characteristics that exemplify the word, examples, and non-examples of the word. The word goes in the middle here, right here. And then here is an example for math of the Frayer Model, and you can put these up on the walls. You can have students work in pairs with them. I mean, there's lots of different ways to manage students working with vocabulary. Another is to have a content wall or a content and a vocabulary. It can be a vocabulary wall, a word wall, some of you know as word walls, or content walls. This in particular is in science, but you've got vocabulary. So here you've got language arts and science. You're doing an integrated lesson, right? So you've got language arts, science, and geography, which is social studies, not science. So you've got like 3 different content areas going here. And you've got the vocabulary words and representative pictures of these words. So you've got visual, and you can easily have kinesthetic, and you can easily have auditory with these particular words. This can't show you all the process of how kids get to this content wall. But you can see they're done by themes. There's a volcano and a photosynthesis, and these are all processes, right? Processes, geologic processes. So one of the things you can do for ELs if you get some time to work with them individually, and frankly, this is really good for younger students who are just learning to manipulate language anyway. If they're really good readers and have good comprehension, this might not be something you would do, but even for me, this was quite good to even practice doing this, is you take a sentence from a text from a book that you're reading with them. So everybody knows the story, so they're familiar with the story. And you take the sentence and you break it down into sentence pieces by clauses. The moose who was quietly grazing in the swamp noticed her friends running by. That's a long sentence. We don't think about that sentence. It's an embedded sentence, no less. It's actually a rather complex sentence. So what was the moose doing? Who did Moose notice? Moose noticed her friends. What were her friends doing? They were running by. So you've got 3 different explanations for that sentence, and you're putting it out, you're analyzing it, you're pulling it out for students to look at. Practice then saying sentence starters. What was Moose doing? What did Moose notice? What were her friends doing? And then you start using the sentences with the words, and then you start adding that all together until you get back to writing phrases and small paragraphs. So the idea is that students get an idea of how our language is put together, because grammar is actually part of the Common Core. And it still is something that students enjoy doing, the analytic task. And it teaches them vocabulary and language. Also, especially for older kids, language and text is difficult. Use visuals. Here we go again, VAK. Show and tell, graphic organizers to organize the information they get from the text. Realia, use real objects, pictures to accompany the text, maps. Teach visual text cues. This is something people don't do a lot. What is the heading? What is the subtitle? What are the labels? What does it all mean? Teach those visual cues so they can access the charts and the graphs in the non-fiction text and the informational text. Connect students always with prior background knowledge. Pre-teach vocabulary, that intentional teaching, front-loading. Pause, ask questions, pause, review ELLs. But so many students will take benefit of this, not just ELLs. Get the gist strategy. So summarize in 10 sentences write 10 sentences about what this reading was about and put them in order. Something similar like that. So play with language. They, especially the young children, let them play, because this interaction piece is the biggest part of language learning as a student learns a second language. And that humor is actually really good for your brain. It helps you cement a lot of the language that you learn. So for language learning and for ELLs and for probably most of your students, start with the concrete. Represent your information with the concrete. Move to symbolic. Picture, symbol. So here we have, that's real water. You just can't tell that it's running there, but that's real water. And then the picture of the symbol for water. Here's the water molecule. Here's the symbol for the chemical symbol for water. Here's just a picture of water that is the symbol. And then take them to the abstract: water, dihydrogen oxide. So you don't want to stay in concrete. You want to move to abstract, but you want to move them sequentially through the symbolic to the abstract so they can make those connections and retain those connections as they're learning the content. And again, I know I'm talking about ELs, but it's really good for a lot of the students that you'll be working with. For language load is how hard the language is. If you remember, I talked about the cognitive demanding and cognitively undemanding. So what you want to do is, if you're teaching language, teach them language with stuff they already know, like the moose story. If you're teaching content, reduce the difficulty of the language. So teach the content, teach the information with simple language. Teach the language with simple information. Hope that made sense. So here's another example of some performance-based assessments we talked about in the first section here. I'm just going to leave this for you to read on your own. If you go to Colorín Colorado, you can find a lot more assessments. And it's not just for Spanish speakers, it's for anybody who speaks a second language or is learning English as a second language. But if you look at these, you know that these are good strategies for just about everybody you work with in class. But I love this cartoon. Dad says to his daughter, "I selected Spanish on the ATM. Now see if you can figure out how to withdraw your allowance." Motivating your kid to learn a second language. So this I would qualify as a performance assessment. If she can get her money out of the ATM by figuring it out, she probably wouldn't even have to read it. ATMs are so simple nowadays. So implications for language instruction. Language acquisition is essentially a social activity, and it's critical to second language acquisition. The social activity is critical to second language acquisition. I think I have a dangling modifier there, a dangling participle. Meaningful interaction is the key. Students placed in structured classrooms where the teacher does most of the talking and the activities are mostly written have little chance for meaningful interaction or language development. And that includes sitting them in the back with a coloring book. Don't do it. Just don't do it. Put them in front of you, get that eye contact, and help them, be there for them. Be ready to give them a little bit of extra assistance. Keep in mind when working with ELs, our knowledge of words determines how we understand text, define ourselves for others, and define the way we see the world. So don't change. So that's all about vocabulary, right? Our knowledge of words. Don't change what you teach, change how you teach it. And we'll talk about differentiation on Module 8. So here are a bunch of resources for working with ELs. Jim Cummins. I think I took something from his lecture in Rich Amato. So the next step for you is to take on the note-taking template, write some notes and ideas in response to the questions in the English as a second language section, which will be collected on Module 8. So with that, enjoy your work, and I look forward to seeing your notes and your thoughts and seeing that reflected in your lesson plans. So have a good working week, and I will talk to you next week.